Queen Elizabeth came within hours of 4 separate wedding nights. Each time something made her cancel at the last possible moment. When she died, they sealed her body in a lead coffin before anyone could look closely. Her tomb has stayed locked for 400 years while every other monarch's been opened. What they found when they undressed her corpse is the reason why. Elizabeth I came within hours of a wedding night 4 separate times, and every single instance ended in what courtiers described as unexplained panic. These weren't political postponements announced months in advance. These were last-minute cancellations that happened when everything was ready, when the groom was waiting, when the wedding chamber had been prepared. The pattern is so consistent, so desperate, that it reveals something historians have missed for centuries. What could terrify the most powerful woman in England so much that she would destroy diplomatic alliances, break the hearts of men she loved, and risk civil war rather than spend one night alone with a husband? The answer isn't in her politics or her psychology. It's in her biology. Every canceled wedding night was a moment when Elizabeth came face to face with a truth that would have destroyed everything if a man had discovered it in the marriage bed. This isn't about a queen who chose power over love. This is about someone who physically couldn't risk the intimacy that marriage demanded, and the evidence has been hiding in plain sight for over 400 years. The first person to nearly discover Elizabeth's secret was the man she loved most in the world. Robert Dudley had known Elizabeth since they were children, both imprisoned in the Tower of London during the reign of her half-sister Mary. They had survived together, and when Elizabeth became queen in 1558, one of her first acts was to make Dudley Master of the Horse, a position that required him to be constantly at her side. They rode together every morning, danced at every celebration, and spent so much time alone together that foreign ambassadors sent shocked reports back to their governments. The Spanish ambassador wrote that Elizabeth visited Dudley's private chambers at night, behavior that was absolutely scandalous for an unmarried queen. Everyone at court believed they would marry. It seemed inevitable. There was just one problem standing in the way. Dudley already had a wife. Amy Robsart was her name, and she lived in the countryside, far from court, reportedly suffering from breast cancer. On September 8, 1560, Amy was found dead at the bottom of a staircase with her neck broken. The official verdict was accidental death, but nobody believed it. Whispers spread immediately that Dudley had arranged her murder to free himself for the queen. What happened in the weeks after Amy's death should have been Elizabeth's moment of triumph. The obstacle to marrying Dudley was gone. She had absolute power as queen and could have overruled any objections from her council. The Spanish ambassador reported that secret wedding preparations were underway. Multiple courtiers recorded in their private journals that Elizabeth had chosen her wedding gown and that a private ceremony was planned for late September, to be witnessed only by her most trusted ladies. Then came the night that changed everything. On the evening the secret ceremony was scheduled, Dudley was brought to Elizabeth's private chambers. What happened behind those locked doors remains one of history's greatest mysteries, but the results were immediate and catastrophic. Servants reported hearing screaming from the Queen's apartments, not sounds of grief or anger, but what one described as pure terror. Elizabeth locked herself in her chambers for 3 full days, refusing to see anyone, even her closest ladies. When she finally emerged, pale and shaking, she announced that marriage to Dudley was impossible. She blamed the scandal of Amy's death, but here's what historians miss. The scandal hadn't stopped her from planning the wedding in the first place. Something else had happened that night. Something in that private chamber that made marriage impossible. But the story was far from over, and the second canceled wedding night would be even more revealing. 7 years passed, and Elizabeth still hadn't married. Her council was desperate. England needed an heir, and the Queen wasn't getting any younger. By 1567, negotiations with Archduke Charles of Austria had been ongoing for years, and finally they reached a conclusion. The marriage treaty was signed. Diplomats from Vienna were celebrating. The Archduke's representatives began making one final arrangement before Charles would make the journey to England: a physical examination of the Queen by physicians to confirm her ability to bear children. This was completely standard practice for royal marriages. Every princess in Europe submitted to such examinations. Mary, Queen of Scots, had undergone one before marrying the French Dauphin. Catherine de' Medici had been examined before marrying into the French royal family. It was a formality, nothing more, designed to ensure the bride could produce heirs. The physicians would verify that the Queen's body was normal and capable of childbearing, then provide a sealed document to the groom's family. Elizabeth's reaction to this routine request was so explosive that it shocked everyone who witnessed it. The Queen fired the physicians who suggested the examination. not dismissed them politely, but fired them on the spot with such fury that witnesses described her as nearly incoherent with rage. She then banished the Austrian ambassador from court, giving him 24 hours to leave England. When members of her Privy Council tried to reason with her, explaining that this was standard protocol that every royal bride accepted, Elizabeth screamed at them that she would rather die unmarried than submit to such examination. William Cecil, her most trusted advisor who had spent 7 years carefully negotiating this match, watched in disbelief as the Queen created a diplomatic incident so severe that Archduke Charles withdrew his proposal entirely. The Austrian court was insulted. Years of careful diplomacy were destroyed in a single afternoon. Elizabeth's own council couldn't understand what had happened. Why would she reject a routine medical examination that every other princess accepted without question? The answer becomes obvious when you consider what such an examination would have revealed. Physicians in the 16th century knew exactly what a woman's body should look like. They had examined countless royal brides and could immediately identify anything unusual. If Elizabeth's body was not as it should be, if something was absent that should be present, or present that should be absent, those physicians would have discovered it instantly. The political damage was enormous, but what terrified Elizabeth's advisors even more was that she had destroyed the marriage not because of diplomatic concerns or political calculation, but because she couldn't allow physicians to examine her body. That distinction is crucial. A political postponement would have involved months of negotiations and face-saving compromises. This was pure panic, a desperate move by someone protecting a secret that couldn't be revealed at any cost. Foreign courts began to whisper that something was wrong with the English queen. The Spanish ambassador wrote coded messages back to Madrid, speculating about Elizabeth's physical condition. The French court spread rumors that she was deformed or diseased. But the truth was more fundamental than deformity or illness. Those conditions could have been managed, explained, or even accepted by a diplomatic marriage partner. What Elizabeth was hiding was something that would have ended her reign the moment it was discovered. The pattern was now clear to anyone paying attention. Elizabeth would go to extraordinary lengths to prevent anyone from examining her body, even if it meant destroying advantageous marriages and creating diplomatic crises. But the most revealing cancelled wedding night was still to come. By 1579, Elizabeth was 46 years old, and everyone knew this was her last realistic chance at marriage. Francis, Duke of Anjou, was 23 years younger than her, which caused scandal, but he was also her most serious suitor. Unlike previous candidates who had negotiated from a distance, Anjou came to England and courted Elizabeth in person. He spent weeks at the English court, and something unexpected happened. Elizabeth seemed genuinely charmed by him. She called him her frog prince because of his appearance, but the nickname was affectionate rather than mocking. Courtiers reported that the queen seemed happier than she had been in years. She laughed more freely, dressed even more elaborately, and spent hours in Anjou's company. On November 22, 1579, in front of the French ambassador and her entire assembled court, Elizabeth did something that shocked everyone present. She publicly kissed Anjou on the mouth and placed a ring on his finger, declaring before all witnesses that he shall be her husband. The court erupted in celebration. After 20 years of refusing marriage, the Virgin Queen had finally chosen a consort. The French ambassador immediately sent word to Paris that the marriage was settled. Wedding preparations began in earnest. The wedding date was set for January 1580. Elizabeth's ladies began preparing the wedding chamber at Hampton Court Palace. They ordered new linens, arranged furniture, and prepared everything for the wedding night. Anjou's household arrived from France with wedding gifts. The marriage contract was drafted and signed by both parties. For the first time in her reign, it seemed Elizabeth would actually go through with it. Then, as January approached, everything fell apart in the most disturbing way. Elizabeth's behavior became increasingly erratic. She would confirm the wedding plans in the morning and cancel them by evening. She developed mysterious symptoms, sudden fevers and weakness that kept her confined to bed for days at a time. Her physicians couldn't identify any specific illness. The symptoms would appear whenever the wedding date was discussed and disappear when the topic was dropped. Her ladies reported that the queen wasn't sleeping, that she paced her chambers at night talking to herself. One servant claimed she heard Elizabeth crying behind locked doors, something the proud queen never did publicly. The French court began to suspect something was seriously wrong. Anjou's representatives sent increasingly concerned letters back to Paris, describing the queen's strange behavior. Finally, in February 1580, Elizabeth postponed the wedding indefinitely. The official explanation was concerns about public opinion. that the English people weren't ready to accept a French Catholic consort. But Elizabeth's own letters to Anjou reveal something completely different. In one letter discovered in French archives in 1892, she wrote about a secret that cannot be revealed and begged him to forgive what I cannot explain. The phrasing is desperate, almost panicked. This wasn't political calculation. This was someone terrified of a truth coming out. The French ambassador sent a coded message to King Henry III of France, describing his final meeting with Elizabeth before leaving England. He reported that the Queen appeared not reluctant, but genuinely frightened of something. He wrote that her hands were shaking and that she seemed on the verge of tears when discussing why the marriage couldn't proceed. Anjou himself wrote to his brother that Elizabeth had confided something to him in private, something that explained everything, but that he had sworn never to reveal it. He honored that promise and took the secret to his grave when he died 4 years later. The third cancelled wedding night had confirmed what some courtiers were beginning to suspect. Elizabeth wasn't avoiding marriage for political reasons. She was protecting a secret that intimate contact with a husband would immediately expose. Most people don't know about the fourth cancelled wedding night because it was never officially recorded. It happened during Elizabeth's famous 19-day visit to Kenilworth Castle in July 1575. Robert Dudley, still deeply in love with the Queen after 15 years, had planned what historians now recognize as an elaborate marriage proposal. He spent thousands of pounds preparing for her visit, more than he could afford, bankrupting himself to create what he hoped would finally convince Elizabeth to marry him. He built private apartments specifically for the Queen, separate from the main castle, connected by a covered walkway that allowed her to come and go unseen. He created a secret garden accessible only through Elizabeth's chambers, filled with flowers that spelled out her initials. He commissioned dual portraits of himself and Elizabeth dressed as a married couple, hanging them in the private apartments. Everything about the visit was designed to create an intimate, romantic atmosphere away from the prying eyes of the court. For 19 days, Elizabeth and Dudley were essentially alone together, with only her most trusted ladies in attendance. On the final night of the visit, Dudley made his move. He had arranged for a Protestant minister to be present, hidden in the private apartments. Only 3 of Elizabeth's ladies were in on the secret: Blanche Parry, Catherine Ashley, and Mary Sidney. These were women who had known Elizabeth since childhood, who were completely devoted to her. If Elizabeth was ever going to marry Dudley in secret, this was the moment. The scene was set, the minister was ready, and the man she loved was waiting. What happened in those private chambers that night was deliberately erased from official records. But in 2013, a researcher discovered a letter that changed everything. The letter was from Lady Mary Sidney to her brother, written 6 months before her death in 1576. In it, she described that night at Kenilworth in terms that are both heartbreaking and revealing. She wrote that the ceremony began, that the minister started the marriage rites, but that when the moment came for Elizabeth to retire to the wedding chamber, the Queen became seized with such distress that she could not stand or speak. Mary Sidney described Elizabeth collapsing, not fainting but appearing to be in genuine physical distress, shaking and gasping for air. The ceremony was abandoned. Dudley, according to Mary Sidney's letter, was heartbroken but not angry. She wrote that he embraced the Queen as one would comfort a wounded soldier, and that Elizabeth whispered something to him that made him weep. Mary Sidney didn't record what Elizabeth said, perhaps because she couldn't hear it, or perhaps because the secret was too dangerous to write down even in a private letter. What's most significant is what happened to the witnesses after that night. Mary Sidney was sent to a remote estate in Wales within a week, officially because of illness, but effectively removing her from court. She died 6 months later at age 41, supposedly from the same illness. Blanche Parry and Catherine Ashley were both given generous pensions and retired from court service shortly after the Kenilworth visit, despite being Elizabeth's closest companions for decades. The Protestant minister who had been ready to perform the ceremony disappeared from records entirely. His name doesn't appear in any church records or documents after July 1575. 4 people witnessed Elizabeth's breakdown on what should have been her secret wedding night, and all 4 were dead or silenced within a year. That's not coincidence. That's a cover-up. So what exactly was Elizabeth hiding that made 4 wedding nights impossible? The evidence has always been there, documented in reports from ambassadors, letters from courtiers, and the observations of people who saw the Queen up close. The problem is that historians have been trained to dismiss or reinterpret this evidence as exaggeration or political bias. But when you look at the physical descriptions of Elizabeth from multiple independent sources, a disturbing pattern emerges that can't be explained away. The Venetian ambassador, a trained diplomatic observer who had met dozens of European queens, wrote that Elizabeth possessed an unusually loud voice and what he specifically described as a masculine manner of speaking. He noted that her voice carried across a room in a way that women's voices typically didn't. Another diplomat commented that she had more the bearing of a soldier than a lady, walking with long, confident strides rather than the mincing steps expected of noblewomen. These weren't insults. They were confused professional observations from men, genuinely puzzled by what they were seeing. The most shocking report came from a Spanish envoy who was immediately recalled to Madrid after sending a coded dispatch. In it, he wrote 7 words that ended his diplomatic career. "Her Majesty's form is not as other women's." That phrase, "her form is not as other women's," is carefully chosen diplomatic language. Ambassadors were trained to be precise in their observations, especially when describing royalty. This wasn't saying she was unusually tall or had an aristocratic bearing. This was saying something was fundamentally different about her physical form compared to other women. The Spanish envoy was pulled out of England within days of sending that message and never given the chance to elaborate on what he meant. Spanish intelligence had apparently learned something concrete about Elizabeth's physical condition, something they considered important enough to recall their ambassador rather than risk him providing more details. But the physical observations went far beyond diplomatic reports. Elizabeth's own tutor, Roger Ascham, who educated her from age 10 and knew her better than almost anyone, wrote something revealing in his private correspondence. He noted that her mind has no womanly weakness, and her perseverance is equal to that of a man. In the 16th century, this wasn't meant as a feminist compliment. It was a puzzled observation from someone who expected female students to think and behave in certain ways, and Elizabeth consistently broke those patterns. She mastered Latin and Greek faster than any student he'd ever taught. She could debate theology with bishops and outmaneuver counselors twice her age. The physical characteristics were equally unusual. Multiple sources comment on Elizabeth's unusually large and powerful hands for a woman. Portraits from the time deliberately minimize this feature, but written descriptions are consistent. Ambassadors noted her handshake was firm, almost masculine in its strength. Her stride was described as long and confident, covering ground quickly rather than the delicate steps noblewomen were taught. Most strikingly, Elizabeth was exceptionally tall for her era. While the average woman in 16th century England stood around 5 feet tall, Elizabeth was described as matching the height of many men at her court. She towered over other women in a way that made her immediately distinctive. Her physical stamina was legendary in ways that puzzled her contemporaries. She could hunt for entire days, outlasting men half her age. She would ride for hours without showing fatigue. At age 55, she danced for 6 hours straight at a celebration, something that amazed younger courtiers. All of these characteristics individually might be explained away as genetic variation or aristocratic breeding. But taken together, they paint a picture that made observers deeply uncomfortable, a picture of someone whose physical form didn't quite match the gender they were presenting to the world. But the most damning evidence doesn't come from outside observers. It comes from Elizabeth's own mouth, spoken at the most crucial moment of her entire reign. In 1588, the Spanish Armada threatened to invade England. It was the greatest crisis Elizabeth had ever faced, the moment when everything she had built could be destroyed. On August 9th, she rode to Tilbury to address her troops before the expected invasion. She was 55 years old, a veteran of 30 years of political survival, and she gave a speech that became legendary in English history. Standing before thousands of soldiers in full armor, she declared words that have been analyzed by historians for 4 centuries. She said, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." Think carefully about that phrasing. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman. Why would she say that? Elizabeth was famously vain about her appearance, obsessive about controlling her public image, spending fortunes on elaborate gowns and jewels. Yet in this crucial moment, addressing her army, she specifically draws attention to having a woman's body while claiming a king's spirit. Was this just rousing rhetoric meant to inspire troops? That's how historians have always interpreted it, as a clever way of acknowledging her gender while asserting her royal authority. But if you know about the cancelled wedding nights, if you know about the desperate measures she took to prevent anyone from examining her body, this speech takes on a completely different meaning. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman. Was she acknowledging a truth hidden beneath her elaborate costume? Was she telling her soldiers in the only way she safely could that the body didn't match the crown? The soldiers cheered her speech, inspired by their queen's courage. But standing there in armor, addressing an army, claiming the heart of a king, while acknowledging the body of a woman, Elizabeth was performing the same balancing act she had maintained for 30 years. She was being honest about the contradiction while hiding the truth of it. The Tilbury speech is famous for its rhetoric, but what if it was actually a confession disguised as inspiration? What if the Queen was telling the truth about herself in the only way she could? Everything about Elizabeth's appearance was designed to conceal. From her 20s onward, she wore increasingly elaborate wigs that completely covered her natural hair. The official explanation was hair loss from smallpox in 1562, but historians have questioned whether she actually had smallpox at all. The illness kept her isolated for weeks, but when she emerged, no scarring was visible, and she immediately began wearing wigs. Those wigs became more extreme as she aged, towering constructions decorated with jewels and pearls that added nearly a foot to her height. What was she hiding beneath them? The heavy white makeup that became her trademark was supposedly to achieve the pale complexion Tudor beauty standards demanded. But Elizabeth took it to extremes that literally poisoned her. She painted her face with Venetian ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar that created a porcelain mask, but also destroyed skin and poisoned blood. By the end of her life, her face was so damaged that witnesses said the makeup came away in sheets, taking skin with it. Why would she subject herself to decades of poisoning, unless she was hiding something beneath that mask? Some historians suggest she was covering smallpox scars, but there are no contemporary accounts of visible scarring that would justify such extreme measures. And her clothing. Elizabeth wore the highest collars, the most elaborate ruffs, the most concealing gowns of any monarch in history. Her dresses had structured bodices that created an artificial silhouette, completely disguising her natural body shape. She never appeared in public without multiple layers of clothing that made it impossible to see her true form. Even in portraits, she insisted on being painted in these elaborate concealing costumes. In an era when many portraits showed aristocratic women with low necklines revealing neck and shoulders, Elizabeth's portraits show her covered from chin to wrist. The ruffs around her neck grew larger and more elaborate as she aged, eventually standing a foot high and making her head appear to float separately from her body. Everything was designed to create distance, to prevent anyone from seeing what was beneath the costume. Foreign ambassadors commented on this repeatedly. They noted that the Queen was completely covered at all times, that even in summer heat she wore long sleeves and high collars. One French diplomat wrote that he had never seen the Queen's bare neck or wrists in 3 years at the English court, something he found peculiar compared to other royal courts where such display was normal. What was she hiding under all those layers? The most disturbing evidence comes from what happened when Elizabeth was dying. By March 1603, everyone at court could see that death was approaching. She was 69 years old and failing in ways she could no longer hide. Her famous energy was gone. She moved slowly and tired quickly, and the sharp wit that had terrified courtiers seemed to come and go unpredictably. Most dramatically, she stopped wearing the elaborate makeup that had been her mask for 45 years. The white Venetian ceruse that had hidden her features was abandoned. She told her horrified ladies that she was past caring what people saw when they looked at her. As her body shut down, Elizabeth's behavior became increasingly strange. She stopped eating almost entirely, managing only occasional sips of broth. Her abdomen began swelling grotesquely over the final weeks, expanding until she appeared several months pregnant. The irony was devastating. The virgin queen who had spent her entire life refusing motherhood now looked pregnant as she approached death. The swelling was almost certainly fluid accumulation as her organs failed, but the symbolism haunted everyone who witnessed it. Then came the strangest behavior of all. Elizabeth refused to go to bed for nearly 2 weeks. She absolutely refused to lie down despite desperate pleas from everyone around her. Her doctors begged her to rest properly. Her counselors implored her to preserve her strength. Her ladies tried every argument they could think of. She rejected them all. She sat in chairs, propped herself against cushions piled on the floor, and let her attendants hold her upright when she couldn't manage on her own. But she would not get in that bed. When asked why, Elizabeth gave different answers, none entirely coherent. "Once I lie in that bed," she said, "I shall never rise again." Another time she insisted that the bed is a trap, that death waits there. Sometimes she just shook her head violently and refused to speak about it. Was this psychological terror a final attempt to maintain control by refusing to surrender to death? Or was it something else? Did Elizabeth understand that once she was in that bed, once she was helpless and dying, there would be people who needed to prepare her body for burial, and those people would finally see what she had hidden for 69 years? On March 24, 1603, Elizabeth Tudor stopped breathing. The moment she died, her counselors moved with extraordinary speed, as if they had been preparing for this exact moment for a very long time. The doors to her chamber were locked immediately. Guards were posted with strict orders that absolutely no one could enter or leave without explicit permission. Only the most trusted ladies in waiting were allowed to remain inside. Even high-ranking nobles who should have had access were removed without explanation. The preparation of Elizabeth's body happened behind those locked doors with only a handful of witnesses, all of whom were given explicit and terrifying instructions. Speak of nothing you see. Nothing. They began undressing the Queen's corpse, removing the elaborate layers that had hidden her body for 44 years. First the jeweled gown, then the multiple petticoats, then the structural corset that had created an artificial silhouette. When they removed the white makeup, witnesses reported that it came away in sheets, literally peeling off and taking skin with it. One lady in waiting vomited at the sight and was immediately escorted out and sent away to a remote estate with instructions never to speak. They removed the corset that had been laced so tightly for so many years that it was practically embedded in her body. When they cut away the final layers, they discovered something that multiple accounts describe in coded language as fundamentally wrong. The surviving accounts use euphemisms and vague phrases that have puzzled historians ever since. Something was not as it should be, either absent when it should have been present or present when it should have been absent. Within hours, Elizabeth's body was wrapped in treated cloth and sealed inside a lead coffin that was soldered shut before rigor mortis had fully set in. The speed was extraordinary and completely violated normal royal protocol. Usually, royal bodies lay in state for days, allowing nobles and physicians to document the death. Elizabeth's body was sealed so fast that the servants who prepared it barely had time to finish before the coffin was closed forever. Those servants were scattered across England within days, sent to distant estates with generous pensions and dire warnings about execution if they ever spoke. 3 of the physicians who had attended her final illness died within a year under suspicious circumstances. One was listed as dying from sudden fever. Another fell downstairs and broke his neck. The third suffered apoplexy. These weren't elderly men at the end of their natural lives. They were experienced physicians in the prime of their careers who all died before they could write memoirs or confide what they had observed. The coffin was rushed to Westminster Abbey and placed in a vault that has remained sealed ever since. Here's what makes this truly extraordinary. King James I became the most zealous protector of Elizabeth's tomb. This is the same James whose mother, Mary Queen of Scots, Elizabeth had imprisoned and executed. James had every reason to diminish Elizabeth's memory, to allow her reputation to be questioned or her remains to be examined. Instead, he issued explicit orders that her tomb must never be disturbed, never examined, never moved under any circumstances. Why would he protect the reputation of the woman who killed his mother unless he knew something? Unless someone had told him what was discovered when they undressed the Queen's corpse? Unless he understood that opening that tomb would reveal a truth that would destroy not just Elizabeth's legacy, but the legitimacy of the entire English monarchy? 4 centuries later, that protection continues. In 2012, researchers excavated Richard III from under a parking lot and subjected him to comprehensive DNA testing and facial reconstruction. Every other English monarch of significance has been studied and examined, but not Elizabeth. Multiple requests from prestigious universities have been denied. Even offers to use modern technology that could scan through the coffin without opening it have been rejected. The official reason is always respect for the dead, but that excuse rings hollow when every other royal tomb has been opened without such concerns. What secret lies in that sealed coffin that the British establishment has protected for over 400 years? 4 cancelled wedding nights, 44 years of elaborate concealment, 400 years of protected silence. The Virgin Queen's greatest secret wasn't that she chose not to marry. It was that she physically couldn't risk the intimacy that would have revealed a truth too dangerous to ever speak. And that truth remains locked in a tomb that will never be opened, protecting a monarch whose reign changed history but whose body told a story the world was never meant to know. If this investigation into Elizabeth I's hidden truth has left you questioning everything you thought you knew about history, then you need to subscribe to this channel right now, because we're just getting started. We uncover the secrets that mainstream historians won't touch, the evidence they deliberately ignore, and the truths that would rewrite everything in the textbooks. Hit that subscribe button because next week we're revealing even more shocking evidence about royal deceptions that shaped the modern world. Drop a comment below with your theory about what was really in that sealed coffin, And if you think it's finally time after 400 years for Westminster Abbey to let scientists examine Elizabeth's remains, smash that like button. The more engagement this video gets, the more pressure we put on historians to finally demand answers. Your comment, your like, your subscription, they all push this truth closer to the surface. Let's force history to face what it's been hiding. Subscribe now, because the truth doesn't stay buried when enough people start digging.